Hello, my dear viewers. This amazing story will be very instructive for you. It is very interesting and beautiful. I wish you enjoy watching it. The boy ran with all his might. The frantic pounding of his heart echoed in his ears. Faster, faster still, or else the stalker would catch up and then he would be in trouble for sure. The shelter superiors would obviously not approve of what he was doing. They don't like him very much as it is. In his hands, the boy was clutching the bun that had caused his rush. He had taken it from the store at the counter, only he had not paid for it, and now the furious salesman was chasing him. Stealing, of course, was wrong. He understood that very well. What he didn't understand was how this situation could have happened in the first place. He hadn't intended to take anything. He went into the store just to look and enjoy the smell, inaccessible to him baked goods. It was part of his amusement. He did that every time he managed to sneak out of the orphanage. But today, some force, perhaps hunger, compelled him to grab the cheapest bun off the counter and dash for his life. The thief, get the thief. There was a shout behind him. Hearing this, the boy ran even faster. What should he do? It was as if the whole city was out to hunt him. His imagination conjured up horrific pictures of him being grabbed and dragged off to the police, or worse, back to the orphanage. In fact, the salesman stopped. Chase a few minutes later. The boy was quick. The theft was a penny, and he needed to get back to his job. But the kid didn't know that, and so he kept running. Even though he was almost exhausted, he did not look around and could hardly see what was going on right in front of him. And then, at some point, he himself did not notice how he found himself in the middle of the roadway. Drivers honking their horns swerved around him, then slowed down. But one thing was clear: disaster was inevitable. There was no way one of the cars could have stopped in time. It flew straight at the hapless thief. Witnesses on both sides of the road froze in horror. Some had already pulled out their phones, ready to call an ambulance. And only one young girl was not confused and rushed straight onto the road ahead of the car. She managed to push the boy out from under the wheels of the car at the last moment, desperately braking another SUV, but found herself in its path. After waiting for the finale, playing about the tragedy, some bystanders hurried on about their business. Others stayed where they were. Women cried, and some men, needless to say, let out a stingy tear. Someone did manage to call an ambulance. The driver, white as chalk, jumped out of the car and headed toward the victim to administer first aid. A few compassionate citizens tried to help him. Soon medics arrived and quickly determined that the girl had suffered a spinal injury. They gently loaded her into a car and took her to the nearest hospital. The boy who had inadvertently caused the accident was forgotten. Everyone forgot all about him. In the meantime, he was watching the whole scene, standing a little aside from the main crowd. As soon as the ambulance left, he let out a sad sigh and headed towards the orphanage. He couldn't help his savior anyway. And if they noticed his absence, it was likely that he himself would need help. It was not customary at the orphanage to punish children physically. Jane woke up in her bed, stretched, and decided to lie down some more. It wasn't that she was lazy or that she had trouble getting up early. It was just that the very process of getting out of bed in her case was difficult. Finally, she decided that she could go no further. She had big plans for the day, and she wasn't about to give them up because of a moment of weakness. The girl sat up, pulled her legs up, and with a familiar motion, shifted her body from the bed into the wheelchair. Drove to the kitchen, made herself breakfast. Fortunately, in the 3 years that the girl could not walk on her own, her fiancé managed to somehow equip the house to make it acceptable for an invalid to live. For example, he hung shelves for her. Without that, of course, it was difficult. Jane tried to push away the wave of painful memories, but it didn't work. She could still see the boy, who decided to run out onto the road for no reason at all. She saved him, but she saved herself. While the ambulance was taking Jane to the hospital, she wondered why she was in so little pain when a huge car crashed into her. Even if not at full speed, but still her head, which she hit on the pavement, hurt. Her arms were sore, her back was slightly stiff, but that was all. It wasn't until she arrived that she learned the awful truth. "Jane, do you feel pain in your legs?" cautiously asked, looking at her doctor. "No," she answered. He sighed heavily and was silent for a while, as if he was thinking something over. "Doctor, what's wrong?" she asked straightforwardly, unable to endure the ominous silence. "You know, you must have felt it. They are so fractured that even the painkillers, the doctors in the hospital, can't take away the pain completely." "What does that mean?" "I'm afraid it means that you have a serious injury to your spine. Damage to the nerve pathways leading to your legs." "Are you saying I won't be able to walk again?" "Well, it's too early to tell. You may regain sensation. And if it doesn't, then I might need an operation. The only problem is that this kind of thing isn't covered by the AMO. And it's not going to be cheap." "That's sad," he summed up. "But don't get upset," encouraged the doctor. "Maybe it will be all right. You'll have to stay here for a while anyway, at least until the fractures grow back." She left the hospital only a couple of months later, already in a wheelchair. She was an old violinist, and Jane was far from her first possession. But it was all the girl could afford. Fortunately, an understanding salesman agreed to bring the purchase directly to the hospital. After all, the world is not without good people. Even then, her family was not poor, like all families. She and her mother, neither of them had much work, but they had enough money for basic necessities, except that at the time of the accident, Jane was unable to stay in her old place. And where to find a new wheelchair? So it turned out that the only breadwinner in the family was her mother. The girl's father had left them before she was born. Jane, of course, was assigned some payments, but on them, of course, it is not a big deal. It's only good if there's enough for food. And as if some evil fate suddenly began to haunt the family. At first, my mother worked and took care of Jane, who was trying to get used to her new circumstances, and apparently, against the backdrop of stress, began to feel bad. So bad, in fact, that she ended up in the hospital. There it turned out that the stress could have been the deterioration of the mother's condition, but was not the main problem. Doctors discovered the last stage of the cancer, and there was nothing that could be done about it. Soon Jane's mother was gone, and she was left all alone. True, her loneliness did not last long. A beautiful young man showed up who fell in love with the girl, despite her disability. They met near a grocery store. Jane unsuccessfully tried to get into the store in her wheelchair. One unfortunate circumstance prevented her from doing so: the lack of a ramp. At that time, she had not yet got used to the fact that it was a normal state of affairs, or rather abnormal, but quite normal. And shopkeepers and local authorities did not care about the needs of people with disabilities. Tears began to well up in Jane's eyes from the pain and injustice, and no one knows how it would have ended if not for his appearance. Having assessed the situation, the stranger took the wheelchair by the handles and gently dragged it up the stairs, and then volunteered to escort Jane around the store as well, just in case any more help was needed. While the young people were shopping, they got to talking. "It's sad that nobody here thinks about people with special needs," he said. "I'm not offended by the truth," Jane replied. "Speak as you do about people with disabilities, but it's not that straightforward. No one will survive, we thought. I'm very grateful to you. From my point of view, this is what any man should have done." "So what's there to discuss? Why don't you tell me the name of my savior?" "David," he introduced himself. "And I'm Jane." "It must be hard for you, huh?" "Yeah, I'm not quite used to my new position yet. Plus, my mom used to help me and now she's gone. But I'm managing somehow. I feel for you. You know what? If I can help in any way, please ask." With these words, he wrote down on a piece of paper and handed her the phone number. Jane automatically accepted the piece of paper, not thinking that she would ever take advantage of this generous offer. "Jane," said David, looking into her eyes, "you are a very beautiful girl." "Thank you," she replied. She looked a little confused. It was the first compliment she'd heard since she'd lost her legs, despite her firm decision to live as independently as possible and not ask for help. There came a moment when Jane had to remember that very piece of paper with a number on it, and she was glad she hadn't thrown it away immediately, as she had intended to. It was 2 or 3 months after the meeting at the store. A pipe burst. She was afraid she was about to flood the neighbors, and the plumber, as luck would have it, was in no hurry to come on the call before she would have been able to at least shut off the water herself. But in her present state, she was not even able to reach the right valve. Finally, Jane picked up the phone and called David. He responded immediately and was able to get to the location within half an hour. In addition, not only did he shut off the water, but he promptly fixed the cause of the problem. From that day on, he was a frequent visitor, and sometimes she needed help. Other times, he just invited him over for tea and something tasty. She liked to cook by then. It was nice to talk, too. David was a wonderful way to brighten up her loneliness. To the girl's surprise, after a while their communication turned into a romantic relationship. After the accident, Jane didn't think anything like that would ever happen to her, and she was, of course, very happy that this had happened. She couldn't even say for sure if she really loved David. Undoubtedly, she had gratitude and many other warm feelings for him, but would she have lived with him without her disability? That she did not know, and she preferred not to think about such things. David, he moved into her apartment, took care of her, helped her. He rewired and rearranged the furniture so that she would feel comfortable in her own home. And indeed, his innovations made everyday life much easier and more comfortable. And just a few days ago, they had a conversation, extremely which surprised Jane, but also, of course, pleased her too. The fact that David came with flowers did not come as a surprise to her. From time to time, the man gave her small bouquets, and now he gave Jane his present. But he behaved rather strangely. He was embarrassed and kept silent for a long time, as if he wanted to begin some important conversation, but could not find the right words or was afraid of spoiling everything. By and large, that was how it was. But at last, he made up his mind. "Will you marry me?" That Jane's consciousness did not even immediately grasp the meaning of what he heard. Meanwhile, David rummaged in his pockets and took out a small box. He opened it and held it out to the girl inside. She saw the ring, plain and unadorned, but dainty and obviously valuable. I don't even know what to say. The feelings inside her were struggling with unhappy thoughts. She wanted to shout out joyously, yes. But is it acceptable to bind a man to such a commitment? "Don't you want to sound depressed?" he asked. "Don't you, my darling?" "I do want to. But should you condemn yourself to a lifetime of disability?" "I thought I had done it anyway. After all, marriage is just a formality. We're living together as it is. I care about you, I love you, and I want you to be my wife." "You don't even understand. Now you can leave any time you get tired of it, without any consequences." "I won't get tired of it. Don't interrupt. Look, after the wedding, it's not going to be that easy, even legally, as far as I know. And it'll be harder for me to accept. Even if you say that the stamp is just a formality, it's not to me. Now, honey, listen to me. I made up my mind when I came to live with you. I love you, and if you love me back, marry me." "I agree," she answered quietly, not finding any more arguments against the idea. And so, not without difficulty, having moved from the bed to the stroller, Jane prepared for the new day. The groom had already left for work, and she had special plans for today. Since there was going to be a wedding, she needed a real dress, a gorgeous white bride's dress. That was what she was going to choose. Getting the stroller out of the house was a lot of fun. But in 3 years, he's been trying to do it quickly and as easy as possible. Good thing there was a freight elevator. Otherwise, it would have been impossible for the girl to get down on her own. Having coped with all the obstacles, Jane went straight to the bridal shop. It was no ordinary store, but a real paradise for those who wanted to get married. Even in her previous life, she had regularly stopped by just to enjoy the sight of gorgeous dresses, and a pleasant, welcoming atmosphere reigned inside. The salon employees were unfailingly polite and friendly. Also, when Jane openly said that she just came in to look, "You'll excuse me, no one has called me to marry, so I'm not to buy, but only to admire. How old are you?" "They will call you again, and you'll already know what you want to pay," smiled in response saleswoman. The first obstacle met her already on the way to the salon. The same absence of the ramp at quite a high staircase. She had no memory of it at all. The circumstance must have been just not paying attention to such things when many people were still working. However, this predicament was quickly resolved. The world is not without good people. 2 men who were passing by took pity on the girl, lifted the stroller right up to the entrance of the store, and held the door. When Jane drove inside, she heard the usual carefree chatter of the saleswomen. It was just as it had been a few years ago the last time she had looked in here. Hearing the sound, the doors opening, the employees stopped chatting. Until then, they had been standing with their backs to the entrance. Now they turned toward the potential client with happy smiles on their faces. But as soon as they saw Jane, those smiles faded immediately. The girl could almost physically feel the icy wave that enveloped her, so cold and unconcerned were the faces of both employees. Jane didn't know them, and he obviously couldn't remember her either. "You've made a mistake, lady," said one of them arrogantly. "This is a bridal shop, not a handicap supply store." "And so," said the other one, turning to her back as if there was no Jane here. How did Jane get in here with her Summer was about to answer something. But then the first sales girl stepped in again, not letting her say a word. "You still have a problem with your hearing. Get out of here. You should have at least thought with your head. What if customers come in now and see you?" "So I am your client," she finally managed to interject. "I need a wedding dress." Then both saleswomen, not embarrassed, burst into hysterical laughter. "Are you going to get married?" she asked the first one in a mocking tone with laughter. "Who's your groom? A helper cat or a stray dog?" More likely a rat got in, pushed by the second just to her liking. But let's say you were determined to buy a wedding dress in the best salon of the city. Measure that, how will you, out of the stroller and try it on. "I saw in the subway," as the beggar stood up. Maybe she was even there. She was going to pay her alms. I mean, we don't take change. Jane had already realized that her usual friendly atmosphere in this store applied only to those who had no obvious signs of disability. But she so dreamed that one day she would go to the wedding in a dress from this very salon. Perhaps that thought alone kept her in place, preventing her from immediately leaving the hospitable establishment. "I have the money," she said. "And it's not a problem to try on a dress. I get dressed in the morning. Whatever you want." She turned to the first sales girl. "Look, if you don't spoil anything, you'll have to pay the full price. We don't have discounts for the crooked and the slanted." And Jane was left alone with the sales girl's dresses, no longer paid any attention to the girl. They continued the conversation interrupted by her appearance. Only occasionally the salon attendants cast a leering glance at her, as if to ask if you are still here. Not without difficulty, Jane picked out some interesting models at a reasonable price. She squeezed into the stroller and tried them on, each one in turn, and one so caught her fancy. It seemed to be nothing special. A dress is a dress. A simple style without frills. It's embroidered discreetly, but with pretty embroidery. But she liked it so much that even moved without being spoiled by angry tongues. It crawled upward again and continued to improve. Exactly until Jane walked out with her find back into the sales room. To begin with, the store employees were picky about the dresses that Jane had decided to give up without finding the slightest reason to be picky. One of them walked imposingly toward the cash register, where Jane waited patiently for her to appear. "This is reserved," she said, without even looking at the item she was about to buy. "Then why is it hanging in the common room unmarked?" Jane knew that it was a lie concocted in haste to deprive her of her coveted purchase. The salesgirl responded with a cackle. "It's none of your business. Choose another. Or get out of here." Jane felt herself beginning to get angry. After all, she had chosen a dress she was perfectly capable of buying. Why should she be denied it? And yet so rudely, as if she had come to ask for it for free, she wheeled her wheelchair into the sales room and looked at the entire assortment once more. Now, already paying attention to completely different things, she chose the most expensive dress in the salon. Puffy, pompous, all in gold. In a word, not at all to her taste, and she was lucky at the cash desk. Even without trying it on, she hoped that the greediness of the saleswoman would be stronger than her desire to mock. "Girl, did you even see how much that dress cost?" one of them asked. "There's a sign on the door of the store. I'll let you know that you can pay for any of your products in installments," said Jane. "I want to take advantage of that. It's only for those who can pay at least in installments. You can hardly afford even a button from this dress. You'd better spend your alms on a new baby carriage. It's so squeaky it's disgusting to listen to." They could have gone on for a long time, but Jane had no more energy left to listen. Tears spurted from her eyes. She managed to throw the dress on the counter and hurried out of the store. She was so nervous she almost drove a tire right down the steep steps. Thankfully, there were people nearby who were able to keep her from that rash step and helped her down safely. On the way home, Jane wondered what to say to David. She didn't want to upset him with such a retelling of events. He does so much for her as it is. He even agreed to marry her. Why burden him with unnecessary problems? In the meantime, she'd already told him she was going to get a dress today. She'll be back with nothing. There would be questions. Of course, she could have bought something simpler at the store. But today, Jane no longer wanted to go anywhere, much less go back to picking out and checking out dresses. The ugly scene, of which she had been an unwitting participant, had taken all her strength. If she were to be greeted again with such a disdainful look, she simply couldn't stand it. In the evening, Jane tried to make herself look cheerful and contented. She even prepared a simple dinner for David's arrival from work. "Where's your wedding dress?" he asked from the doorstep. "You know, I went to this salon, looked at expensive dresses, but they do not look for that money. I didn't really like anything. I'll try a less posh place to look." "Well, okay." He easily agreed. Time passed, however, and things did not move forward. Jane couldn't bring herself to go to any other salon and possibly go through the same humiliation. It was as if that trip had broken something in her. "Cute," she said one day. "Let's postpone the wedding, but what's the rush?" "Something's wrong." "What makes you think that all of a sudden?" "So there's no way to find the dress." She lied. She lied. "Screw the dress. Just sign for what you've got. There's not going to be a big party anyway. We were planning on sitting quietly with you and Mom. But why do we have to get all dressed up? No, I can't do that. We should at least have a dress. Otherwise, it's not even a real wedding." "Well, suit yourself." David sighed. He was clearly not happy with the outcome of this conversation, But this time Jane stood her ground. They didn't have much money for a real wedding, not enough for anything. What would it be enough for? Better, of course, to put aside for an operation for herself, thought skeptically. An inner voice tuned in. What good would that do? What she could set aside a drop in the ocean. Fiancé is not rich. Like his family, worked as best he could, but the bosses did not give him a promotion. They don't give it to people like me. I work honestly. I don't lick my boss's backs, David said in this respect. Jane, of course, was no slacker either. She had inherited an old laptop from her mother, so she used it as a part-time dispatcher in a courier service. She did not get much money, but in combination with payments from the state, it was barely enough to live on. However, to pay for the operation was nothing to dream about. Such unhappy thoughts swirled in Jane's mind all the time. One day she decided to take a walk in the park to dispel this gloomy train of thought. The girl slowly drove her baby carriage through the alleys, admiring the surrounding beauty. But even that did not help to free her head from heavy thoughts. And suddenly, she saw right in front of her a boy who looked about 14 years old. He overtook her and now rushed along Jane, noticed her and her hair, and a large mole on the neck. There could be no doubt. This was the same boy whose rescue had cost her her own legs. At that moment, the boy turned around and stopped dead in his tracks. Jane realized that if she'd seen him from the front, she wouldn't have recognized him. She hardly remembered his face, but the model mole was permanently etched in her memory. Besides, he was noticeably taller. The girl had pushed the child out from under the car, and now there stood before her a teenager, quite handsome, well-built, if a little too thin. He was more of a boy than a young man. To Jane's surprise, the boy stood in one place for a while, as if he had made some important decision for himself, and confidently walked straight toward her. "Hello," he said. "You probably don't remember me, do you?" "I remember you very well," said Jane, "but I'm surprised you remember me." "How could I not remember a man who sacrificed himself to save me? My name is Sam, by the way." "I'm Jane." "Jane?" he exhaled, gathering his courage. "I owe you an apology for the whole situation with your leg. It's after the accident. I also—" "You have nothing to apologize for," she said firmly. "If there is one thing I am glad of, it is that it is not you who is in a wheelchair now. The more so that my legs can still be repaired, but I need a lot of money for surgery. I do not have so much. I would be glad to help you." Sam said sadly, "But I have nothing myself. I live in an orphanage, but they don't treat us well. They don't always feed us. Even I almost got run over by a car because of hunger." "How come?" surprised Jane. "You see, I'm ashamed to even think about it. I had no breakfast that day, and there were fresh buns on the counter at the store. No money. So I couldn't resist. Took one. Only the saleswoman noticed how she chased me, so I was afraid of the road and that jumped. So ashamed of it all. But stop beating yourself up. The main thing is that I drew the right conclusion. And if you get hungry or need anything else, you'd better come to me instead of stealing. I live in apartment 10 over there. Don't be shy. What I can help you." "Thank you," he responded with a heartfelt expression from Sam, and ran off to go about his youthful business. Jane turned the stroller around and went home. This meeting had, in a way, had a beneficial effect on her. At least her sad thoughts were replaced by concern for the poor orphan boy forced to steal buns to survive. For a couple of weeks she waited, practically never leaving her apartment. Maybe he would take her up on her offer and drop by for a visit sometime. But as time passed, it never happened. Jane decided that he must be embarrassed to ask for help. In this, she could understand him better than anyone. And soon thoughts of the boy again gave way to her own problems and worries. And it was at that moment that a knock sounded on the apartment door. Jane went to open it, thinking that it was her ward who needed help after all. But David was ahead of her. Instead of Sam, a young man appeared on the doorstep. He was dressed tastefully, obviously in expensive clothes. What could such a man be doing in their backwater neighborhood? Jane couldn't imagine. Nevertheless, he was here, standing on the doorstep of her apartment, and seemed to annoy her fiancé with his mere appearance. "Did you have the wrong address?" the latter inquired unkindly. "Hello, I think not." The stranger, on the other hand, spoke as politely and calmly as possible. "It's apartment 10, isn't it?" "Well, let's say." "And there's a girl named Jane who lives here, who gets around in a wheelchair?" "Yes, that's me." Intervened in the conversation as Jane drove up. "What can I do for you?" "It was you who helped me," the man replied. "My son was saved by Sam. My name is Simon, by the way." "How come?" "He told me he was in an orphanage. And to tell you the truth, there's no doubt about the way he looks." "That's right. He was in an orphanage until recently. I picked him up a few days ago. You see, that's the story here. When I was just 18, I got into a relationship. It seemed like forever at the time. I guess it always does when you're in love for the first time. And then it all went wrong. We fought all the time over nothing. We didn't really see eye to eye. We talked like that for a couple of years and then broke up. It was a terrible scandal. And then she called me recently. Well, never mind why. Well, we fought again. And in tears she told me that when she left me pregnant, she had an abortion and did not dare. And she did not need a child, so she gave him to an orphanage. Barely found out which one, and so found Sam. And he told me about you." "And what do you want from us?" suspiciously frowned, asked David. "I want to return Jane's kindness for kindness. Sam mentioned that your legs are amenable to treatment, but that a costly operation is necessary. I'm willing to pay for it." Jane noticed the way David stepped in. She understood perfectly well the reason why it happened. Her fiancé hated rich people. From his point of view, they got all their money dishonestly, because it was impossible to get rich just by working. And so one of these rich people offers to pay for his bride's operation. That's a real humiliation. A reminder that he himself doesn't have that kind of money and never will. "We don't need anything from you," he said categorically, and they wouldn't even let him open his mouth. "We can raise the money perfectly well without your help." "Why are you doing this?" "I didn't mean any harm. Don't think of it as a handout. Don't take it that way. You suffered because of my son, even though he didn't mean it. And now I'm obliged to compensate you, as long as it's fortunately possible." "I agree," Jane said at once, not letting David answer for himself again. He threw a disgruntled look at his fiancée but remained silent. He frowned as the girl exchanged contacts with Simon and made arrangements for the most convenient time to go to the hospital. And as soon as she politely said goodbye to her guest and closed the door behind him, the real scandal began. "How could you agree to this?" David practically shouted. "How could I agree to what?" "The offer to give me back my legs, to give me back my ability to walk." "You know what I mean. How could you take money from this man? It's not like he's done anything wrong that would make you ashamed to take him up on his offer. It's enough that he has the money. You don't earn that kind of money, honestly." "David, it's like you're not happy that I'm finally going to be able to walk normally. You won't have to babysit me like a little kid anymore, you know. I told you before. It's not hard for me to take care of you. You. How does that make me feel? Don't you ever think about it? It's just humiliating. It's humiliating to take money from a complete stranger." He stood his ground, David. "Would we have saved the money? Maybe not right away, but we would have gotten you back on your feet without his dubious help." This conversation was repeated in one form or another over the next 2 weeks. All the while, Jane was preparing for surgery, and David was trying to talk her out of immediate treatment. The girl even got the feeling that he needed her in a wheelchair more than he needed her healthy. But to understand what caused it, she could not. Jane left for the hospital with the same quiet scandal. David flatly refused to accompany him. She had to ask Simon for a ride. He willingly provided his own car and driver, who helped the girl to get to the hospital. The same day, she was admitted for surgery. Jane spent several long hours under anesthesia while the best surgeon in the city worked on her. When she regained consciousness, she immediately tried to stand up and experienced bitter disappointment. Though she could now feel the touch on her legs, they did not want to obey her. Not all at once. A sweet, smiling nurse, as if she sensed that the patient had awakened. She entered the room, checked the readings on the strange devices to which Jane was connected. The injury that prevented your legs from working properly has been repaired by our doctors. You can feel them now, and you can feel them now, and you can control them. But as I understand it, you haven't been able to walk for years. 3 years, said Jane, quietly, trying to stifle her tears. Here we are. You haven't put any strain on your muscles in 3 years. But of course, they have weakened a great deal. Physically, you are able to walk, but in practice you will have to learn it all over again. But don't worry. We have a great rehabilitation program. Not a single patient has ever left here in a wheelchair after an operation like this. They all left on their own feet. Thank you, almost whispered Jane. After the nurse's words, it was as if she could breathe easier. She had already managed to imagine that the operation was useless, and the only effect of it was that now her legs would also hurt, and she would still not be able to walk. Come on, honey. I understand the condition you're in. I've been in your shoes myself. You mean? Yeah, I had a bad trip down the slide. Can you imagine? I was 15 at the time. Thought I'd never walk again. But my parents wouldn't give up. Eventually they found a clinic. That's when I decided to go into medicine. Now you wouldn't know that I'd been injured like that. Right? It's the same with you. Will come out. You, by the way, go lawless. I don't like that. Okay. Jane smiled. She was now fully confident that a complete victory over her ailment was just around the corner. Still, it's one thing to hear the assurances of a medical professional, and quite another to see firsthand a man who had undergone a similar operation and now can live a happy and full life. Then began the long weeks of rehabilitation. As Nurse Jane predicted, we literally had to learn to walk again. And it was even harder than the first time. At first, she couldn't move any of her muscles. No matter how hard she tried at this stage, they just massaged her and put her legs into some fancy machines. A month later, she was able to move her toes on one of her feet. Before, she would not have thought that such a simple action could cause so much joy. It seems that it was at that moment that the girl finally felt that she could really get back on her feet. Gradually, Jane learned to flex her limbs again, and after each such exercise, her muscles ached mercilessly. But she understood this well. If they hurt, it meant there was something to hurt. It also meant that she could feel such an important part of her own body again. And the doctor said it was a good sign. And only after 3 months, she was finally allowed to try to take her first uncertain steps, first with the obligatory support of special devices, and then freely. At this point, Jane was literally crying with joy. She was finally able to walk. The only thing that upset her during this long period was her fiancé's behavior. Once in a while, he would come to the hospital to visit her, and the more progress she made in mastering her own legs, the more gloomy and sullen David became. As if he really didn't want his fiancée to walk again. The one who came by to check on her almost every day was Sam, sometimes accompanied by his father. And these two, without a doubt, were happy for her progress, encouraging her, helping her in any way they could. The boy was absolutely delighted that he had managed to find his father, and also for the reason that his father was rich enough to pay for the operation for the girl who had saved his life. And with his stepmother, Simon's current wife, apparently got along quite well. Jane was discharged from the hospital 6 months after the operation. Of course, it was a long time. But she walked out the door as the nurse had promised, on her own 2 feet, even if she had to lean on a stick for now. It was still incredibly beautiful, and after a while, as promised, this extra support could be dispensed with. Of course, right after Jane was discharged, she went home. She still had hope that David might finally let go of his childish resentments and be truly happy for his bride. Now she would be able to pick out the best dress possible and have a proper wedding. As soon as the girl opened the door of the apartment, she immediately realized something was wrong. In a few seconds, it dawned on her. There was a luscious scent of women's perfume in the hallway. And not only had Jane herself not been here for 6 months, she was not in the habit of wearing perfume at all. And David's mother preferred light and weightless scents, so this option could be discarded as well. Then Jane noticed other details. A woman's coat on a hanger, high-heeled boots near the entrance, and worst of all, a dress carelessly tossed on the back of a chair. Already realizing what scene awaited her, Jane entered the bedroom, and sure enough, there were 2 people sleeping peacefully, her fiancé and a stranger, both completely unclothed. They were snuggled up against each other as if they were glued. "What does that mean?" Jane asked loudly, breaking the idyllic scene. The woman drowsily opened her eyes. David jumped up, already staring in surprise at his fiancée standing at the head of the bed. "David, who is that?" muttered his mistress. "It's no one. I'll deal with it now. Sleep well." "Nobody means nobody," smirked Jane. "Sleep well, girl. I don't suppose you even know that this apartment doesn't belong to David, but to me, and that this David has a fiancée who does not want to see you in her bed." The woman is dumbfounded, flapping her eyes, moving her gaze from David to Jane and back again. She seemed to be completely speechless from what was happening. The man, on the other hand, decided that he had been silent for too long, and it was time to speak up. "Why didn't you tell me when you wanted to come?" he began in an accusatory tone. "So you could get your mistress out of my apartment." "Just so you understand, she's not a mistress," he exclaimed with unexpected passion. "She's my real fiancée, and I don't need you now at all and never have. All I wanted was your apartment. I couldn't bring her into my mom's 1-bedroom apartment. I was going to get my own place. How long? Would a wheelchair user live? I was even ready to take care of you until you died. But no, that rich guy had to show up and ruin everything. She saved his son, you see. I thought it over so well, I calculated all. I was messing with you, you crippled, miserable man. It just turns out like that." "No, I think I'll keep the apartment as a nurse's fee." David was about to add something else, but he was suddenly interrupted by the loud banging of the front door. As he spoke his fiery monologue, he did not even notice how his sister-in-law hurriedly dressed and left the apartment. Apparently, was not going to come back. Either she did not want a fiancé without a square of her own, or she did not want to stay with a man who allows himself such mean deeds. "Why, you beast," he practically shouted at Jane. "Couldn't you have rubbed it in later? Get out of here now." Fearing that David's shouting might escalate to violence, the girl was forced to leave her own apartment. Tears streamed down her cheeks. She had absolutely no idea what to do next. For hours, she just walked around the neighborhood, shuddering at every rustle. It seemed to her that her ex-fiancé was following her. Finally, Jane decided to dial Simon's number. She had no desire to go back to him for help. He had already done too much for her. Still, she had no other options. She had nowhere else to go. And she didn't want to leave her mother's apartment to that scoundrel. Sam's father listened carefully to her story and just half an hour later rushed to the bus stop, under the roof of which Jane was sheltering from the rain. Along with him came a pair of sturdy men. The sight of them was enough to bring David to his senses, and he agreed to leave the apartment voluntarily, taking all his belongings. "Jane, if you'd like, I could leave some bodyguards with you," he said. Then the problem was solved for, say, a couple of weeks, just in case he ever thought of coming back. "No, I wouldn't," the girl replied. "I don't think he'd want to come back here anyway." "Well, suit yourself. But if you do call me, I'll be sure to send someone over." "All right. Thank you very much." "You're welcome." So Jane had to get used to her new, completely independent life. And the first thing she decided to do was to find a normal job. She posted her resume on several well-known websites, sent her feedback for jobs, but apparently potential employers are deterred by the large gap in her employment history. In a couple of months, she had not received a single invitation for an interview. Meanwhile, her money situation was getting more and more dire. She was no longer considered disabled and therefore no longer eligible for the appropriate government benefits. Those miserable kopecks that were paid, and the position of a remote dispatcher barely enough to pay for utilities and the cheapest food, and yet needed to pay for drugs, which the doctor told not to skip taking. Without them, the process of final recovery could be delayed, if not completed at all. Besides, it would not be a bad idea to buy a special simulator. In general, there were many expenses to be incurred, and the income, in fact, was not at all. And when Jane was desperate for help, Simon showed up again out of the blue. One day he called her and said, "Jane, hello. Don't be alarmed, but I'm calling on business." "Hello, Simon. What can I do for you?" "I accidentally came across your resume on one of the websites. I understand you're looking for a job." "Very much," Jane admitted honestly. "That," she said. For some time they discussed various details, duties, salary, and other related things. And then Simon named the address of the future place of work, and the girl was stunned for a moment. It was the same salon where she had so unsuccessfully tried to buy a wedding dress. It turns out that these not tolerable salesgirls were also thieves, and apparently she was not the only one who was rude. And Jane's life began to get better. The job was to her liking. Customers left the salon happy and always with the goods. Revenue began to grow steadily. In addition, Jane, with Simon's permission, did some rearranging of the shop floor, which also benefited her. But there was still a lot of time and effort to be put in to get the salon out of the hole the previous employees had driven it into. Sam was eager to communicate with Jane, and she didn't mind at all. Often on weekends they went to the city together, either to the exhibition, or to the amusement rides, or to the zoo. Simon had nothing against such socializing, but it did not please his wife, who tried by all means to keep the boy away from such outings. Jane suspected that she was just jealous and saw her as a rival, who wanted to steal her husband. And despite the fact that her and Simon's communication gave no reason for such thoughts, she could well understand the woman's feelings. You bet she could. First, her husband invested in the treatment of an almost stranger girl, then almost in the middle of the night went with bodyguards to some showdown on her first call. And now he gave her a job with a good salary, and now his newfound son, which he had always dreamed of, prefers the company of this very girl to her company, though not conflict with his stepmother. There is much to worry about. But Jane, however, had not the slightest idea of a romantic relationship with Simon. She was well aware that this man was not at her level, and she was not ready for new hobbies. And yet her soul hurt after the betrayal of David. The man, for his part, though he treated her with obvious sympathy, was more like a little sister. A chance to connect the relationship with Mary, his wife's name, was Jane's 16th birthday party for Sam, where she was invited as the guest of honor. The whole evening, the wife literally sprayed venom in the direction of his imaginary rival and demonstrated in every way that she did not want to see her in her house. At first, Jane just ignored all these attacks. Then she just went to the birthday boy and communicated mainly with him. But eventually, unable to endure this kind of toxicity, She went out into another room. Tears were already coming to her eyes over such unfair treatment. Among other things, Mary's behavior was more reminiscent of the bullying to which she had been subjected by the salesgirls at the salon where she now worked as a receptionist. In fact, she suspected that this appointment had something to do with Mary's present abhorrent behavior, and there was no way to explain that Jane had received this promotion because of her hard, industrious work and not from access to her husband's bed. But as soon as Jane crossed the threshold of the room, she forgot the reasons that had brought her here. The room housed something like a portrait gallery, a multitude of photographs of various people who were apparently close to the owner of the house and in a place of honor. Right in the middle of the wall hung a picture of a very familiar woman. At that moment she heard a noise behind her and turned around. As it turned out, it was Simon, having noticed her absence, who had come to see if everything was all right. "For God's sake, don't be angry with Mary," he began in a guilty tone. "I understand that she's not behaving properly, but she's understandable too." "I'm not in the least offended," Jane replied. "It's just... Anyway, it doesn't matter. Would you rather tell me, please, how do you know this woman? What is the woman in the center photo?" Actually, this house used to belong to my father. He moved away not so long ago. Leaving it to me, he wanted to settle down in his old age, close to nature, and he didn't have time to take his things out yet. The woman in the picture is his first love. I wasn't particularly interested, but they had a sad story there. As far as I understand, they had a big fight and she left him. He never managed to make it up with her, but he kept his feelings for life. Jane stood silently for a few long minutes, looking at the picture and trying to make sense of what she had just heard. Then she slowly turned to Simon and said softly, "That's my mother, isn't it?" The man looked intently at her face and then gazed at the portrait. He repeated this procedure several times until at last he drew a conclusion, which he said aloud, "You look just like her. From the first moment I saw you, I wondered, whom do you remind me of?" "And who does she remind you of?" A Roman voice came from the door of the room in the passage. Crossed her arms over her chest stood Mary. Apparently, she had just walked in and had not heard much of the conversation, and so, of course, she drew the wrong conclusions once again, which further swamped her prejudice against Jane. "Mary, look. Isn't that what I think it is?" she said in a mocking tone. "Couldn't you have been a better coder? What kind of nerve to make out in the corners with his mistress at a birthday party of his own son at home, when your wife is literally in the next room?" "Mary," said Jane quietly, "look, there really is no relationship between us other than business. What's more, we have just found out that such a development is impossible under any circumstances." "Why is that?" Jane went over to the portrait of her mother and stood up straight next to him. Mary gasped. She didn't need any more words to understand what the guest meant. Her resemblance to her mother was quite obvious, and no doubt Simona's wife was aware of his family history. "So you're brother and sister?" "It would appear so," Simon responded. "And luckily for all of us, we really haven't even thought about any kind of romantic relationship. We haven't, have we?" "Mary, I just wanted to thank our son's savior, that's all. I had a fiancé until recently, and he left me in a very ugly way," said Jane. "Almost left me without an apartment. So now I don't even know when I'll be able to think about someone romantically again." "Wait," Mary frowned. "Almost left me without an apartment once, and just kicked me out. When I came home from the hospital, I found him with his mistress. And what was I going to do with my stick against a healthy man? I had to leave. So that's why you went to see her that night," the woman guessed, and looked at her husband disapprovingly. "You could have explained that, by the way." "Yes, I probably should have done, before I answered that moment. But at that moment, I didn't have much time. And then somehow, by the way, I didn't have to. Jane, perhaps I owe you an apology for my disgusting behavior. I don't need to apologize to you for your disgusting behavior. I understand perfectly well why it happened. But I hope this misunderstanding will be a thing of the past. It most certainly is. Well, where have you brought the cake yet? Hearing from the door a little indignant voice of Sam, and the adults, who had completely forgotten about the birthday boy, went out of the dessert and party with everyone else to the pleasure of the guy. Both women, who in a short time had managed to become dear to his heart, were now communicating warmly and casually. The rest of the party passed in a quiet, friendly atmosphere. The next day, Simon and Jane went to visit their father. She had been troubled all her life by the fact that she did not know who he was and the reason he had left them. And now it appeared that it had not been his decision at all. Besides, she wanted to make sure there was no mistake. Robert turned out to be an older but still sturdy man. He barely looked at his guest and then whispered in a husky voice, "Melissa." "Not really." Simon smiled at him. "Are you coming out?" "I'm her daughter," Jane interjected, "and we suspect yours too. But we can run DNA tests to be sure if you don't mind, of course." Robert didn't think to object. That same day they went to a private lab and submitted the necessary samples. And the very next day they received an answer. He and Jane were clearly related to each other, most likely father and daughter. Oh, would I have known that Melissa was pregnant? Robert sighed then. I never would have let her go. And now she was growing up without a father. You must have thought I was some scoundrel who left your mother alone with the baby. Not without that, replied Semyon, embarrassed. Now I know the truth, and thank God you are alive. So now we can make up for lost time. Wait, you're saying I'm alive? As if my mother. Unfortunately, she's dead. It's soon 2 years since she saw. As at these words, tears glistened in the eyes of the elderly man, and she realized that, in spite of everything, her father had never stopped loving her mother over all these years. It was both sad and very touching. Unable to contain the emotion, Jane hugged her father for the first time in her life. From then on, she visited him often, and over time they developed a really warm and trusting relationship. It was as if Robert was seriously determined to make up for the lack of fatherly warmth that she hadn't received while living away from him. Sometimes these family gatherings were joined by Sam, whom Mary now let go without any problems or question. She also stopped hindering her conversations with Jane. Occasionally they would go out as a big family. On one of these trips, Jane met William. He was a longtime friend of the Simon family and his business companion. He took a fancy to the girl at first sight. His courtship was long and beautiful. Patiently waited until, at last, she could once again believe that not all men are like her ex. He did not rush her, did not push, but he was always there for her. And in time he managed to melt Jane's heart. And everything she wanted happened. A fancy wedding, her in a beautiful dress from that very salon. He in an elegant suit, an expensive restaurant where the closest people to the newlyweds gathered to rejoice with them. And after that, amazing trips to Europe, just for the two of them. In addition, Simon decided to give his sister and her new husband a truly royal gift. But he gave it not at the wedding, but after they returned from their trip. Apparently, in order to extend their sense of celebration a little longer. Jane, he's blossomed since you've been the receptionist at my salon with William, he began from afar. I don't want to brag, but it was easy. My sister smiled. Yeah? I can imagine after all the trashing the previous employees did in there. I don't know how you did it. Are you questioning my wife's talents? William grinned feignedly. Simon somewhat retorted. And that's why I want to give her my half of the shares invested in this salon. And so it's completely at the disposal of your family. And Jane won't be just some receptionist. She'll be a full-fledged owner. I think she's up to the task. Oh, you don't have to do that. I'm sure I can handle it, Jane worried. You can, her husband said confidently. Of course it'll take some learning. But it's never been a problem for you, has it? Haven't you? And don't forget, I'm always here for you no matter what. I'm sure you are, Jane smiled. And I love you very much. And I love you even more, William smirked. Simon rolled his eyes, knowing that it would take more than a minute for the two of them to start talking like this, and they wouldn't get tired of it at all. But he was not ready to listen to all this, and so he went to prepare the necessary documents for the transfer of the salon in the hands of the newlyweds.